So hello and welcome everybody to Creative Dignity's Handloom Day celebration. And thank you for everybody who's joining on the panel, but also thank you for all the audiences who are coming in. I think there were a series of really interesting events and webinars today. So if you have come to us at 5 o'clock, hopefully you'll have a lot more to contribute at the end of the session when we open it up for questions and discussion. I am Achal. I'm a volunteer with Creative Dignity. I work in the arts and culture space, but Creative Dignity is something that I volunteer because I think it was a really interesting sort of a network that came about during the pandemic. And I think Mira can tell us more about what it does right now. But basically, at the time in 2020, when everything had shut down, a few of these networks kind of spontaneously kind of came up to kind of just say what can we do for craftspeople at this point. But also taking on the thing to say, and therefore, how do we make this crafts community a little more resilient so that uh, we are able to take some of these crises that keep hitting the crafts community time and again. And so there has been now a lot of work on the ground. At that time, of course, it was all online. But now around 26 states, there is on-ground presence. There's a whole network of several kind of members. And I think what is the beauty of it, it just unites all these different stakeholders across the craft sector, where the craftsperson themselves are held at the center of it. But this entire ecosystem that needs to be a part of making sure that the artisan can afford to do what they want to do is sort of nurtured. तो ये अब हो गए हैं 2-3 साल. It's a space of a little maturity has come in, and working groups, and there are a lot of initiatives that are happening across, and a lot of it is just bringing people together like today to discuss some of these points. So there is not a single point agenda. There is never one perspective that answers some of these issues because they are so complex and there are so many points of views to be considered. So I think that's what CD is best at, is to make space for all kinds of voices if they are in the sector. Meera, you want to add anything to that?
No, thanks, Achal. I think you captured it really well. So I think the philosophy, primary philosophy is that what is it that all of us can do better together? I mean, just so that we feel less alone, less helpless in what we're doing, because we know that the problems are really huge, have been since so many decades. And so if whether there is a hope that all of us with our different skills, different abilities can really make that difference or shift, if you like, for the sector. So that's the hope. And we hope that in few years, we should be able to see that.
So I think I'll circle back to what the session is for today and why it is so complex. And I think all of us have been grappling with it. So, coming to the term of cultural IP, the term was coined in 1993, Shweta Shri tells me, by Irene Daes, an academic, diplomat, and United Nations expert, best known for her work with the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations. And I think the paper that first referenced this term was called Our Culture, Our Future, uh, which in its title itself kind of shows the spirit in which it was written, and was a driving force behind the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people. In India and in other places, there is also an organization called CIPRI, the Cultural Intellectual Properties Rights Initiative, who have been raising awareness and spearheading a worldwide movement supporting the recognition of cultural intellectual property rights for craftsmen and women who are custodians and transmitters of traditional garments, traditional designs, and traditional manufacturing techniques. And I really like the way, the fact that the garments, designs, techniques are kind of seen as these distinct things that the crafts community continues to hold. And this topic is something that I think CD has been grappling with a long time. I think we are revisiting it in a big way after 3 years. And 3 years ago is when a prominent fashion designer did a more mass collection that looked like it was hand block printed when it wasn't. And it led to a lot of discussion and conversations at that time, a lot of reflection for this ecosystem around crafts and IP. And I think in 3 years' time, we are kind of reflecting now on what has changed. And it doesn't feel like much has changed because we have a more recent example when a sari that a master craftsperson had created. And when I say created, I don't even just mean that they had woven it. It was his own design that was projected by a fashion designer at his own on social media. uh, we also recently, there has been so much discussion about this, had this, India had the opportunity to represent the nation through fashion at an international stage. And it ended up carrying a digitally printed motif of what is a handloom technique. So, not to kind of center our debate around this, but these are some examples. And these two distinct examples also talking about one area which is about sharing credit and IP in the design space around collaboration and partnerships. But a larger area also is around fakes and what is being called as craft washing, which I think Meeta Mastani had written about a lot in the Indian context 3 years ago. But also, this is something being investigated globally. Dr. Sandra Alfordi, a professor of crafts history, was, I think, the first one to come up with it. So today, with some really fantastic panelists, we want to have a more constructive dialogue on, what are these issues of ownership, of IP, and how are these different players have their own point of view, and what are the challenges in some of these really utopian scenarios when we build up of, how this should play out. But there are a lot of challenges to that, and we like to address some of that. Just a hygiene announcement. Please keep all your interactions respectful and mindful of differences in backgrounds and lived experiences and cultures. We would want the audiences to put their questions on chat and possibly only unmute yourself when asked to during the question and answer session. You can raise your hand. Otherwise, do not unmute yourself. Please ask whatever or comment in the chat if that is something that you want to discuss. And just as I was going to start with Dr. Ismail Khatri, he's got my. So, इस्माइल भाई, मैं एक्चुअली आपसे स्टार्ट करना चाहती थी ये डिस्कशन.
जी.
और स्पेशली क्योंकि आप का जो रोल है क्राफ्ट्स पर्सन के जैसे है, एक आर्टिजन, मास्टर आर्टिजन के जैसे है, एक आप एक लीडर माने जाते हैं उस संदर्भ में. बट ऑल्सो यू आर अ डिज़ाइनर इन योर ओन राइट, यू आर एन आर्टिस्ट इन योर ओन राइट. ऐसा नहीं है कि आप सिर्फ काम करते हैं, कोई और बताता है. सो जो इंटेलेक्चुअल प्रॉपर्टी जब हम कहते हैं और जो ओनरशिप लेते हैं हम डिज़ाइन का, तो आप आपके संदर्भ में, आपने आपके अनुभव में क्या रहा है ये कोलैबोरेशंस, क्योंकि आप इंटरनेशनली भी कोलैबोरेट करते हैं, नेशनल डिजाइनर से कोलैबोरेट करते हैं, म्यूजियम्स में आपका काम दिखाया जाता है. तो आपको ये ओनरशिप की किसका काम है वो और कैसे दर्शाना चाहिए, इसके बारे में आपका क्या राय है?
सही है. अभी ऐसा है कि कला और कारीगरी दो चीजें है. कला जो है वो मन से उत्पन्न होने वाली चीज है, और कारीगरी जो है वो स्किलेड है. उसके अंदर दो चीजें इस्तेमाल होती है कारीगर की. दिमाग भी इस्तेमाल होता है और शरीर भी इस्तेमाल होता है, हाथ और पैर. तो जो डिजाइनर होते हैं तो वो खाली अपना कॉन्सेप्ट देते हैं कि कहीं से भी, कि जो डिजाइनर बनते हैं वो कोई भी थीम लेते हैं. जैसे कोई ब्रह्मांड की थीम है, या सूरज का ग्रुप का थीम है, या कोई पहाड़ की थीम है, या कुछ भी है, उसके हिसाब से वो सोचते हैं. लेकिन कारीगर के बगैर ये बना नहीं सकते. और कारीगर की, उनका एक ही दिमाग इस्तेमाल होता है. कारीगर की दो चीजें इस्तेमाल होती है, शरीर भी इस्तेमाल होता है और स्किल भी इस्तेमाल होती है, दिमाग भी इस्तेमाल होता है. तो जो डिजाइनर लोग हैं कुछ, मतलब हम लोग जो आगे बढ़े वो डिजाइनरों के साथ मिलके ही आगे बढ़े. और ये ऐसे समझो कि एक रथ का दो पहिया है. लेकिन कुछ डिजाइनरों के साथ, कुछ व्यापारियों के साथ खास करके जो तकलीफ होती है कारीगरों को, वो ये होती है कि जो अच्छा माल होता है वो तो वो ले लेते हैं आराम से, लेकिन जो कोई रिजेक्शन हो गया तो वो सारा के सारा कारीगर के ऊपर थोप दिया जाता है। तो हमने करीब ऐसे समझो 30 साल पहले एक HHEC का काम किया था। तो कपड़ा उन लोगों का था और मजदूरी हमारी थी। तो साहब ने पूछा था कि भाई अगर रिजेक्शन हो गया तो क्या करेंगे। तब मैं वैसे छोटा था, लेकिन हमने ये निर्णय लिया था कि जो रिजेक्शन होगा न उसमें अपने दोनों का 50-50 हो जाएगा। कि मान लो कि 10 चादरें बिगड़ गई तो 5 मैं रख लूं, 5 वो रख लेंगे। या कपड़े का पैसा अ, मैं दे दूं, अगर मेरे पास निकल जाती है तो मैं कपड़े का पैसा दे दूं। या तो फिर रंगवाई जो मजूरी की है वो मैं छोड़ दूं। तो इसमें भी दोनों का भागीदारी हो न मेरे समझ में तो ठीक रहता है। बाकी डिजाइनर के बगैर हम लोग जब शुरुआत किया था तो हम लोग काफी मेहनत करके एक चीज बनाते थे। और जो कस्टमर आते थे वो ज्यादा से ज्यादा बोल के क्या जाते थे, वेरी नाइस, वेरी ब्यूटीफुल। खरीदता कोई नहीं था। लेकिन जब डिजाइनरों का रोल आया न तब ये लोग खरीदने लगे। तो वो जो चीजें बनती है हकीकत में रोल तो दोनों का ही होना चाहिए, हिस्सेदारी दोनों की होनी चाहिए। लेकिन जो जहाँ पे तकलीफ होती है न उसका सॉल्यूशन करना चाहिए। कि जैसे 1 लाख रुपए का ऑर्डर मिला और उसमें 10,000 का रिजेक्शन हो गया। अच्छा, अभी 10,000 का रिजेक्शन जो हुआ है तो उसमें 5 कारीगर भुगत लेवे, 5 वो पार्टी भुगत लेवे।
हाँ,
गुर्जरी का जब हम शुरुआत में काम करते थे तब ऐसा होता था कि हमारा जो रिजेक्शन होता था न तो वो लोग ले लेते थे कुछ डिस्काउंट करके।
हाँ।
और
नहीं
फिर
तो
इसमें से फाइलें बनाते थे या फिर कुछ और बना लेते, थैला बना के वो लोग बेच डालते थे। तो हो जाता था। लेकिन कारीगर दूसरी इसमें तकलीफ ये होती है कि जो डिजाइनर डिजाइन बनाता है ना वो बोलता है ये किसी को नहीं देना मेरे सिवाय। ठीक है, उनकी मेहनत है, हम दे भी नहीं सकते। लेकिन जब रिजेक्शन आता है तो फिर हम क्या इधर रख के अगरबत्ती तो नहीं कर सकते कि वहां रख दे वे, बस इसको रोज पूजा करे, ऐसा तो इसको तो बेचना पड़ेगा ना। अच्छा, बेचेंगे तब वो बोलते हैं कि कोई अपने पहनने के लिए ले जाए, उनको बेचो। अब अभी ग्राहक के ऊपर नाम तो नहीं लिखा है कि वो अपना पहनेगा या फिर बेचेगा या वेबसाइट में डालेगा। उनकी मेहनत है, हम समझते हैं। लेकिन फिर जब ये प्रॉब्लम होता है ना तब मेरे हिसाब से 50-50 होना चाहिए।
बिल्कुल।
और का कुछ लोग ऐसे भी आते हैं जो ये कहते हैं कि हम कारीगरों को प्रमोट करते हैं, और हकीकत में प्रमोट नहीं करते, अपना ही काम करते हैं, सिर्फ दिखलावा होता है। और इसमें भी क्या है कि सब सरके नहीं है, कई ऐसे नेक इरादे से बेचारे आते हैं और ये ऐसा काम भी करते हैं। तो ऐसे लोगों से फिर हम लोग तो दूर रहते हैं कि जो।
तो एक बार मुझे ये बताइए, एक तो बात हो गई रिजेक्शन की, जबकि स्पेशली जब डिजाइनर अपना डिजाइन देता है और
हाँ,
वो उसका डिजाइन है तो वो बोलता है ये तो सिर्फ मेरा डिजाइन है, तो
हाँ,
आप कहीं और नहीं बेच
नहीं,
सकते,
हाँ,
तो वो एक बड़ी समस्या हो जाती है। पर दूसरा ये जो आप कह रहे हैं, कुछ लोग जो हैं जो बोलते हैं कि हम करेंगे तो आपको प्रमोट, पर उनका खुद का ही प्रमोशन होता है। मतलब
हाँ,
आपको काम तो शायद मिलता है पर आपका जो नाम है वो जुड़ता नहीं है। तो क्या
हाँ।
इस बात से तकलीफ होती है, या फिर धंधा मिल रहा है तो करना चाहिए, इस हिसाब से आप जुड़ने को राजी हैं? मतलब
ना वो
आपके राय में क्या है ये कि आपका नाम जुड़ा रहना क्या आपके लिए महत्वपूर्ण है?
नाम तो कोई खास चीज बना है नहीं तब तो नाम जोड़ना ही चाहिए। बाकी रेगुलर जो बनाते हैं उसमें तो मेरे को नहीं लगता कि नाम जोड़ने की जरूरत पड़े।
तो एक दूसरा फिर मेरा आपसे क्वेश्चन है, और ये अजरक में तो बहुत आपको भी मिलता होगा और तकलीफ शायद पहुंची होगी, हमको तो होती है कि कई बार जो है अजरक है वो स्क्रीन प्रिंट करके डिजिटली प्रिंट करके मार्केट में चल जाता है अजरक के नाम से।
हाँ,
तो ये ज्यादा तकलीफ दे बात होती है क्या कि आपका
हाँ,
नाम अच्छी चीज से जुड़े ना जुड़े, पर गलत चीज से ना जुड़ जाए?
हाँ, वो तो सही है। लेकिन अभी क्या है, इनको GI मिला है ना,
हाँ।
उसमें थोड़ा डर बैठ जाएगा लोगों में कि ऐसा
हम्म।
करने में। क्योंकि
तो
जो GI का जो रूल्स है कि जैसे देखो हमने काम किया, अब काम तो कोई भी हमारे पास ले जाएगा, व्यापारी भी आएगा बेचारा, ऑर्डर देगा लेगा। उसकी दुकान के अंदर अगर जो खास लोग हैं जो असली माल ही चाहते हैं, कि जैसे अहमदाबाद में हमने किसी दुकान में दिया तो कोई कस्टमर उनके पास आया कि भाई जीआई टैग वाला माल हमको चाहिए, तो उनके पास अगर हमारा माल होगा और जीआई टैग वाला होगा तो वो दिखाएगा, वो खरीद लेगी, बराबर। लेकिन अगर उस व्यापारी ने किसी स्क्रीन प्रिंट का माल जीआई टैग करके बेचा और जो पकड़ा गया तो उसके ऊपर 14 लाख की पेनल्टी है। फिर जो लोग नकल करते हैं, जो मोटिफ अजरक के हैं और उसकी नकल करते हैं, तो उसके अंदर उनके ऊपर 7 लाख का जुर्माना लगेगा अगर नकल करना, तो उसके लिए हमको केस करना पड़ेगा, हमको ढूंढना पड़ेगा और उनका आधार पुरावा वगैरह रजू करना पड़ेगा। तो ये बात भी थोड़ी तकलीफ वाली है। तो लेकिन जो रूल बना है और जीआई मिला है, इसकी वजह से ऐसा करने वाले लोगों के दिल में थोड़ा डर बैठेगा कि ऐसा करेंगे और कभी फंस गए तो फिर पेनल्टी भरनी पड़ेगी। तो इसका सॉल्यूशन तो थोड़ा इसमें हो जाता है। बाकी तो क्या है कि अपना देश के अंदर अलग अलग तरीके का मार्केट है। हमारा जो मार्केट है वो कोई समझता है जिस चीज को, या तो अपर मार्केट में, तो वो लोग खरीदते हैं और हमको काम मिलता है, ऐसा नहीं नहीं मिलता। फिर इसके नीचे भी मार्केट है, फिर इसके नीचे भी मार्केट है। अपने पास तो ऐसी मार्केट है कि 25 रुपये में साड़ी मिल जाती है पॉलिएस्टर की। तो और ये जो काम करने वाले हैं वो लोग तो अपने ही है देश के, बाहर का तो कोई नहीं है। तो मेरा हिसाब से ये है कि ये दुनिया में पहले से ही चलता आया है, आजकल नया शुरू नहीं हुआ। तो खैर ठीक है वो तो, लेकिन जो जो असली चीज है ना उसकी तो वैल्यू आज भी है और 1000 साल के बाद भी रहेगी। कि ऐसे समझो कि धौलावीरा के अंदर जो निकले मिट्टी के ठिकरे, उनको दिल्ली के अंदर म्यूजियम के अंदर रखा है, ऊपर गार्ड बैठे हैं बंदूकें लेके, कोई इतना ठीकरा वहां से ले न जावे। तो ये वैल्यू क्यों है कि किसी ने मेहनत की, किसी ने मिट्टी को कलारा, उसको पीटा, फिर बर्तन बनाया, फिर पकाया, फिर खाना खाया लोगों ने, फिर टूट गया, उसका ठीक रहा है। ये क्या मेहनत की हुई है, 5000 साल के बाद भी वैल्यूबल हो गई है। तो ये ऐसी है। और अपने पास क्या है कि अभी अ, जो नेचुरल डाई का असल माल बनाते हैं वो लेने वाले बहुत कम है, लेकिन काम तो मिल रहा है। लेकिन लोग स्क्रीन प्रिंट का मांग रहे हैं, अभी क्या करेंगे? डिजिटल का मांग रहे हैं, फिर क्या करेंगे? तो अभी तो डिजिटल के अंदर भी कुछ ऐसा काम निकला है कि रंग भी पका रहता है और जल्दी तैयार भी हो जाता है। वो तो कपड़ा हमारे रेट से भी कम में मिल रहा है, हमारे बच्चे भी वो वैसे कुर्ते पहन रहे हैं। तो डिजिटल एक तरफ ही होता है, दूसरी तरफ व्हाइट दिखता है कॉटन का।
हाँ।
लेकिन ये जो चीजें हैं वो टिकी हुई है और उनकी खरीदार भी है। तो फिर हमको ऐसे नहीं लगता कि इसमें कुछ नुकसान होगा। सही बात ये है कि जो असली जो था, कि जो ट्रेडिशनल मोटिव था या ट्रेडिशनल डिजाइने थी, वो जो लोकल लोग पहनते थे वो उन्होंने तो करीब करीब पहनना भी बंद कर दिया है। अभी ये दूसरा रास्ता बन के फैशन में जो गया है, उसके अंदर या तो कॉन्टेम्परेरी है, या तो कुछ जो ट्रेडिशनल का कोई बॉर्डर, कोई बीच वाला, कोई इधर उधर करके डिजाइनर लोग बनाते हैं और वो चल रहा है। और जीआई में भी इनकी जोगवाई रखी है हमने, कि जैसे अजरक का दुपट्टा बनाया, तो जो अजरक का जो असली मोटिव था वो तो एक अलग चीज था, लेकिन दुपट्टा बना है वो अलग है। तो उसमें एक कलम है 24-25 का, तो उसके अंदर ये सारे आ जाते हैं। ठीक है।
और जो जीआई का जो आपका अनुभव रहा, ये कितना मुश्किल था या कितना आसान?
कौन सा?
मैं पूछ रही थी कि जीआई जीआई का जो एप्लीकेशन करना और ये जो इसके
हाँ
लिए जो
हाँ
भी
हाँ हाँ,
प्रोसेस
समझ
रहा
गए,
था वो कितना
समझ गया,
इजी या
वो समझ गया। वो मतलब इजी
डिफिकल्ट
तो नहीं था।
रहा था?
इसमें ऐसा था कि हम लोगों ने करीब 10 साल से शुरुआत की थी, और मन मान लो जीआई लेने में 10 साल नहीं लगे। अभी ये गवर्नमेंट ये कह रही थी कि आप लोग एप्लीकेशन करो। हम एक तो कारीगर है, कपड़ा बना सकते हैं, लेकिन ये जो कागजात वाला मामला है ना वो हमारे बस की बात नहीं। तो फिर सरकार को हमने कहा था कि भाई कोई ऐसी एजेंसी बिठाओ जो ये काम को हैंडल करे। तो फिर इन लोगों ने टेक्सटाइल कमेटी को सुपुर्द किया था। टेक्सटाइल कमेटी ने फिर सारे कागजात बनाए। इसमें हमारा रोल तो बहुत रहा, क्योंकि उनको जो चाहिए डॉक्यूमेंट वो तो हमको ही देना पड़ेगा। उनको तो पता नहीं है कि क्या है अजरक क्या नहीं है। लेकिन मेरा ख्याल ये है कि हमको करीब 1.5 साल लगा ये करने में, और मिल गया। वैसे हमने शुरुआत तो 10 साल पहले से की थी, लेकिन 10 साल पहले से जो शुरुआत की थी ना, उसमें डिस्कशन में वो बोलते थे आप करो। मैंने बोला पापा ये अकेले मेरे बाप की ये प्रॉपर्टी नहीं है, ये जो प्रॉपर्टी है पूरे समाज की है, और बौद्धिक संपदा है। और बौद्धिक संपदा का जो मालिक है वो गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया है, और इसकी एप्लीकेशन गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया को करनी चाहिए। फिर मैंने उन लोगों ने एक सवाल पूछा था मेरे से कि अजरक में ऐसी क्या खासियत है। मैंने बोला ठंडी में गर्म रहती है, गर्मी में ठंडा रहता है। तो वो बोले कि इसका प्रमाण क्या है। अभी हम कारीगर लोगों के पास क्या प्रमाण होगा। मैंने बोला ये जो क्वेश्चन है ना वो साइंटिफिक क्वेश्चन है, और ये आप लोगों को किसी साइंटिफिक से करवाना चाहिए। ठीक है, इसका तो मैं आपको जवाब देता हूँ, मेरे को जो आता है कि अजरक को जलाओ, उसके अंदर से जो धुआं निकलेगा वो ब्लू कलर का निकलेगा, और दीवार के बगल में रखोगे अजरक को तो दीवार ब्लू हो जाएगी। अच्छा, अभी ब्लू होने का कारण क्या है कि जो इंडिको जो डाइंग है ना वो माइनर वैक्स जैसा है। तो उसके अंदर जब आग लगती है तो कलर इसके अंदर घुलता है और दीवार के ऊपर अप्लाई दे देता है, मतलब चिकना ही है एक तरह का। तो गर्मी ऐसे होता है कि जब ठंडी होती है और ये कपड़ा ओढ़ते हैं तो इनका रेशा जो है कपड़े का वो चिपक जाता है, हवा का आवन जावन नहीं होता, तो गर्म रहती है। और जब गर्मी लगती है तो ये अपने आप रेशा खुल जाता है, हवा की आवन जावन होती है, तो ये हो जाता है ठंडा। तो जो इंडस वैली के अंदर जो किसान ये अपना कैटल हर्डर रहते हैं ना वो इसको इस्तेमाल करते हैं। बगल में ये डेजर्ट भी है, और डेजर्ट में जाके ऐसा व्हाइट कपड़ा पहन के
हाँ जी।
जाएगा तो अगर वो कहीं बेहोश हो गया या बुखार आ गया तो ढूंढ बगल में पड़ा होगा तो भी ढूंढने को मिलेगा नहीं। लेकिन ये डार्क कलर का कपड़ा होगा तो
हाँ
1 किलोमीटर दूर से भी हाईलाइट होगा। और दूसरा, वो डेजर्ट के अंदर रात को बहुत ठंड पड़ती है और दिन को बहुत गर्मी लगती है। तो ये एक ही कपड़ा उनको 2 सीजन में प्रोटेक्ट करता है, वरना गर्म जब ठंड लगे उसके लिए गर्म कपड़ा ले जाए, और जब गर्मी लगे उसके लिए ठंडा कपड़ा ले जाए। तो इसकी मेन खासियत ये थी। फिर मैंने उनको बोला कि आपको है ना एक डेवलपमेंट कमिश्नर का ऑफिस अलग से रखना चाहिए। तो भारत के
हाँ।
अंदर कई कलाएं हैं,
तो
एक कला नहीं है।
इस्माइल भाई, हाँ
हाँ
इस्माइल भाई, तो ये तो है कि हमारे जो भी पारंपरिक ये जो भी हमारी कलाएं हैं, इनका सिर्फ एक ये नहीं होता है कि सिर्फ ये एक मोटिफ है या सिर्फ ये एक कपड़ा है, इसकी बहुत खूबियां होती है
हाँ
और वो
हाँ
समझना बहुत ज्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट होता है,
हाँ
जैसे कि आपने अजरक का ये सब बताया।
हाँ
और ऐसे ही सिर्फ आप कच्छ में ले लीजिए, भुज में ले लीजिए, पूरे हिंदुस्तान में ले लीजिए, बहुत कुछ है जो ऐसा हमारे को बहुत जरूरी है कि हम उसको थोड़ा प्रोटेक्ट कर पाए। ये तो अजरक
हाँ
में बहुत
हाँ
ही अच्छी तरीके से आपने जीआई वगैरह ला पाए। अब क्योंकि थोड़ा समय भी कम है, मैं
हाँ ठीक है।
डेविड से भी जरा बात करूंगी। हेलो डेविड, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah.
So just coming to this whole point of, one is the idea that uh, somewhere the craft sector feels failed when these big opportunities come, and designers don't bring crafts into the conversation or into their design. uh, but there must be challenges, and it is, I do not know whether it is fashion failing design or crafts failing the fashion person at that time, not to be ready to support you in those opportunities. So what, from your point of view, are some of the challenges of working in this space and working with those large opportunities when they come?
This is, I have to, I'll start by saying that I'm not an expert on IP, so I won't be able to speak on that with any great depth. But I think there are several factors that we need to consider. One is that I think we probably have the richest and the most diverse textile craft traditions in the world, which are thankfully still in many cases alive and functioning. But having said that, um, it is also an extremely, in many cases, the crafts come from many, uh, almost centuries, I can say, of tradition. And we are now in a particular time in history when there is a lot of change. We need to examine also, for example, the biggest transition has been in many craft, particularly as we start talking about designers and fashion, is that the end user for the craftsperson has changed considerably. In fact, not totally, as well as the sociological and environmental and cultural aspects of that particular product. Products were designed traditionally for particular communities in particular environments at a particular time in history. And that those structures have now fallen apart. And so they are now working with probably urban consumers in most cases. The traditional communities that consume the product have moved on or do not require that kind of, because craft and craft textiles play a very important role in identity. Every single fabric, like in the case of Ajrak, for example, it was worn by certain communities in Kutch. In fact, I've been, I think, to Dhamarka and been to the villages there. So I know it's very culturally specific. When we begin to move now, as we are now, and you're reaching out to a completely different audience, a lot of these changes now are going to be questioned. How does the crafts, I can look at it from the perspective of how does the craftsperson remain relevant in this changing scenario, economically relevant. I think the cases of craftspeople like the one, like, the situation right now of craftspeople who've adapted to the new markets, who are producing a product for the new markets, are the ones who are making that transition and who are, in the best cases, good business people. Um, we need to also look back, I think, historically, I think, which is very important, as because India has, this is not a recent phenomena. India has been, I think, one of the world's greatest suppliers of textiles through history, through the world, through the globe. And that was really because we are also, the craftsperson in India has always been an excellent business person. We manufacture textiles for the world, for different cultures. We got ikat for the Indonesians. We've even woven royal ikats for the Indonesian royal families. We print the fabrics on the East Coast. You go to the Chickenaika Pet, you'll find fabrics are designed for a particular kind of community. The Madras checks for Nigeria. We have exchanged ideas across centuries. So there is also the question of global heritage when it comes to designs. We don't hold on to anything particularly. And if I may also touch, I'm not an expert on Ajrak, but I do know that traces have been found even in ancient Egypt. Now, the exchange of ideas, the exchange of motifs is another conversation altogether, which I am really not equipped to, go into right here, but I think it's open to discussion. And then the other thing is, for example, there are certain things that as you begin to adapt to a contemporary customer, you will find that the structure of many things needs to change. When I speak as a textile person, so it may be a bit technical, but one of the greatest challenges I would say that we face with hand-woven textiles, not printed, because printed can use power loom fabric. In fact, I think they mostly use power loom fabric, which is quite stable. And once we start working with handloom fabric, and the majority of handloom fabrics have been developed really for unstitched garments, for example, and therefore the warp and the weft is designed in such a way that the fabric moves. Because as you know, Part of the garment hangs on the cross, part of the garment hangs on the straight grain. The grains change as a piece of fabric wraps around your body. So there's an excellent logic behind the structure of a handloom fabric. But as we start moving handloom, and now again we talk about fashion and we talk about design, we're talking about co-opting these fabrics into stitched garments. They fall apart in many cases because the structure is not adequate for stitching. You get seam slippage. I mean, I know this from experience that some incredible fabrics just cannot be stitched unless the garments themselves have absolutely able to withstand very, very large or not, there's no fit. So they can't, but even then, they're not really been developed over the centuries for cutting and stitching. So intervention is then going to be required to start changing the warping structure. I say this from my experience because this is one thing that we do. We change the reed, we change the number of ends per inch, we create a denser warp, a lighter weft. So now that kind of intervention is a part of how textile craft is moving in one direction. And I think from my perspective, it's valid because those fabrics can now be used for cutting, for stitching and construction, which we need. I mean, I need to stitch clothes at the end of the day, and I can't have them tear. So that is another aspect. So now when you have all these factors coming in, how do we maintain? We can't really maintain something in a state of frozen. I don't know exactly what the correct term is, things move, things change. So I think our conversations need to be around the way craft evolves, which it does, because I can say that from our experience, we've worked with extraordinary people over the past 20, 30 years who have adapted to the kind of products that we need to make, because we work a lot in the craft sector. I mean, it's not the entire part of our business, but it is a very strong part of our business. And we've had very good relationships with people because they're willing to have these conversations. But it's a process. And then on the other hand, I have several points regarding craft. Another one is that this question he brought up this very interesting, Ishmael, about rejection. Rejection comes from a lack of understanding that craft product deals in small numbers. Repeats are small. So as you go on repeating, you're going to find inconsistency. People reject when textiles are inconsistent because they are imposing the values and the requirements of industrial textiles onto craft textiles. Somebody who buys 10,000 meters from a mill will expect every single meter to be identical. But if you buy 1,000 meters from a handloom weaver or from a printer, you're going to find that as the fabric moves along, there are going to be changes, right? Because of the nature of handwork. It is crucial that we address this problem, and it is something that I think organizations like this one and all of us who are in this space start a conversation about and tell people that those standards are not relevant here. Number one, inconsistency is a part of the manufacturing process. We have to be able to accept that, understand it, and appreciate it for the value it gives to the product. That is one way in which, so a buyer who walks in and says, can you give me 500 meters of this print and expect an identical, to look like it's a completely identical piece for all 500 meters is obviously making a mistake. Lack of education is what I would say on behalf of the buyer. And also, I think communication on the part of the maker, in this case, the craftsperson, by telling them, you cannot get this. This is what we can do for you. This is the strength of what we do. So that's another aspect of that. And the third is that I think anything that is made by hand, by very necessity, is also short-run production. It's labor intensive. We have to be able, for it to ultimately be valued and to survive into the future, has to move slowly out of the low price ranges and has to move higher up the ladder in terms of pricing, because we undervalue handwork. We expect to go to any bazaar on the street and expect to buy something. I've seen people bargaining over handloom saris in the melas. and trying to get the price down. But I mean, so it's unless we address these attitudes, there's going to be very little change.
Yeah. So I just kind of trying to pull out those strands around, what cultural IP, and for somebody who's been working in fashion and working with crafts for so long, is one, for it not to look at a static kind of fixed definition of what that craft is, because that will be self-sabotaging. For example, if you're changing the warp and weft of it, and to serve the purposes better of the contemporary requirements, even if we do have a safeguard around what that craft is defined as, has to allow for this change and has to allow for this evolution. Otherwise, it will be difficult for the craft to continue to adapt to the new consumer, to new design requirements. And so we definitely don't want to get to a point where the safeguarding makes it rigid. uh, and the other thing that I wanted to kind of touch upon is is this sharing of credit. For example, this uh, the handloom techniques and the way that it has done for the unstitched garment, the saris, is not a patented technique. Like, handloom is not patented. It is being practiced in so many ways. When you add to that by experimenting and this iterative process, and you've added to that whole stream of, so many exchanges that have happened over the year, you're not trying to safeguard to that saying, I can use this sort of a technique, because you're also dipping into a river where a lot of people have contributed to. So where how does IP play a structure? Would you therefore say that individual contributions have to be safeguarded? um, and it could be at the technique level, at the garment level, at a design level, or we have this tradition of where all these crafts people, Ismail Bhai is not going to say this is my design, nobody else can use this particular motif. Community has owned these motifs. Even if the main motif is comes from a new designer, you will use a border somewhere, you will use line, you will use dot somewhere, which is like, we kind of say that's the general vocabulary. But that vocabulary is adding value to your design. That vocabulary has evolved also over centuries of this community's contribution. So how does one start to unpack that, to say where does what end, where does it end, to say, oh, these are generic and this is special? And does it remain special only till the point it becomes a general thing, like, it just becomes accepted, so you think it's general because it's become so familiar? And is there something there that the fashion community also needs to recognize, that these languages, not so much the particular print or a particular cut, um, there is a design language that you have as a designer. There's a design language that the Khatri family and the Ajrak Pur and Ajrak tradition has. And there is something to be said about when it comes together and they collaborate. And where does therefore, where is the IP there therefore situated? And this is just a general question, I'm not expecting answers, but like, if you have any reflections on where you have seen examples, or which has been meaningful in this sense. um,
It's a very difficult question, actually, Anshul, for me to, like, for example, when we intervene with, say, handloom weavers and we change structures, which we are doing whenever we can. We're doing some very interesting experiments right now with ikat weavers by changing the yarn and the constructions. That remains with them. And I hope that if it benefits us, they will also use those same structures for their other buyers too. Yeah, because I mean, we exchange. We would not be able to make our products without their skills. And we bring in contemporary ideas, and probably we bring in the market response, consumer response. I mean, it's all a bit idealistic. I mean, we hope it will be beneficial. I think sometimes it is, because I've seen some cases that has been beneficial for some of the people we've worked with over the past 20 years. Maybe in some cases it hasn't, and they still this thing. But by and large, it's an exchange. I don't really know how to ring fence this. Where do I
yeah,
start and where do I stop,
yeah. So ideally
Because
it shouldn't, right? Like, that is the dialogue, that ideally it shouldn't. Ideally, you are contributing, like you're saying, you're
we are a
bringing
part of
something.
it.
Yeah, you are also a part of the same this thing. You're not keeping yourself distinct to say this is mine,
Yeah.
and you're doing it for me. uh, we see that a lot more, I think, in the visual design thing, but that is just a part of it. Sometimes the
Yeah.
garment cut may be a part of it, and you don't want that to be replicated. That is something you'd like to ring fence. But for
Yeah.
us to kind of this see this as a bigger stream where a lot of people are taking out but also putting in, and if you're not putting it in enough, this will dry up, sort of an analogy. But I think that is something that that we do want fashion practitioners that kind of take on so much from the stream also to kind of contribute, and not only kind of so ideally do not like just take a ikat print and digitally print it without having some way to kind of go back to the community to say we did use your aesthetics, we did use something that has actually taken this community a long time to evolve and reach to. I will now, we will come back to questions, and I would like also the panelists to think about questions that they have of each other. We'll come to Ravi, and while Bhakti will add the official introduction, I have been following Ravi on Instagram and sharing so many of his posts because I love the lovely considered business that he runs around crafts of Karnataka. It's called Metaphor Racha and has a beautiful feed that talks about the several issues from the point of view of an entrepreneur. I think he does an exemplary job of educating customers and how mindfully one can invest in artisan spaces. And he represents a key part of the ecosystem that holds up the craft ecology. So Ravi, if you would like to come in and just speak from the point of view as an entrepreneur around some of these challenges, because I know that you have invested a lot in kind of buying old blocks, in your kind of friction with how khadi is kind of defined, and we know now that while khadi was had done some very punitive measures initially, but they are also broadening their outlook to kind of saying this is whether it's a trademark issue or whether this is just a descriptor issue. But there are several of these challenges that as an entrepreneur also that you navigate. Would you like to reflect on some of those?
Yeah. Thank you, Anita. Can you hear me? Okay. The challenges has been not so much from the craft sector as such. I mean, the production wise, we don't have. We work with a lot of artisans where the 70% of the people who work there are first generation viewers. So there is nothing called heritage culture, the kind of a fabric which we are using, except the khadi as a fabric. I mean, today's khadi itself is a modern day khadi, what we see today, especially after 1940s. And the khadi was born through an intellectual demand, especially around 40s. When that gets trademarked, it becomes an intellectual monopoly. Yeah. So with intellectual monopoly, you can actually drive a scarcity. And with the scarcity, you can always say, well, we don't have enough weavers to weave national flag, right? So this is the other side of trademarking, the other side of what happens with monopolizing. For example, we have around the KHDC, that is almost a defunct Department of Karnataka Handloom and Department Corporation, says that we have around 42,000 existing weavers even today. This is the census of 2020, which means that even if a weaver is actually weaving 5 meters of a fabric, we can actually produce 52.5 lakh meters a month, right? Now this 52.5 lakh meters requires, I don't know how many people know, it requires around 10,300 acres of cotton land. It's a wasted opportunity. It's a wasted opportunity. So for us as an entrepreneur, it is very difficult that how do you connect these dots, especially in this khadi sector, that the cotton is grown in one side and then it's monopolized by KVIC in actually slithering. Then the spinning happens somewhere else, and the weaving, probably the farmer and the weaver is staying next to each other, but then the cotton has to go all around South India to come back to the same village. Right, so this connecting the dots is a huge problem. Uh, Khadi trademark has been a setback for a lot of entrepreneurs, including me. You won't see dedicated Khadi brands so much, is also because of that. Many brands have started moving away from khadi, including me. I might, because it doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't make sense anymore to work with khadi. So the challenge has always been from the government, not from the craft sector itself.
Yeah, so I hear you, and I know that this issue has been contentious for very long. But also, I think the way the khadi, the khadi has been held by the government, while it has kind of made it very difficult to engage with khadi, and therefore we want people to leave. But if you kind of make it so kind of rigid and so complicated to engage with, you will turn people away. And similarly, I think how do we build a good practice of safeguarding crafts and craft languages in a way that you still encourage people to engage with it, so that tomorrow when an opportunity comes to a designer, to an entrepreneur, they don't turn and say, actually, it's just easier for me to digitally print it. Why should I even bother doing it's anyway a hard life. Why make myself do the extra mile of engaging with these practices that we value very much, but you're just making it more complicated to engage with. And at that point, I think I would like to bring in Shway as the legal expert here.
Sorry, I mean,
uh,
sorry, just one
yeah,
second.
yeah,
See, when we talk about handloom or a khadi or a print or a craft, we actually talk about the realm of materialism. You will never be able to solve this problem if you look at everything as a material. Yeah, I mean, it has to be thought something beyond that. I mean, whether it is a khadi than, it's not a khadi as a material, there is a khadi-ness in life. It's a mindful consumption. Whether it is what you eat, what you hear, what you do, I mean, kaya manasa vacha, what we call it, what you think, what you do, and what you say, if it aligns, then we would not be having this kind of problem. You don't need a GI tag, you don't need a mutual, because we don't think and say and do exactly what the three align, and it does not align, we are having this problem. Everything cannot be boiled down to khadi. I mean, there is no virtue actually by just wearing handloom and khadi. I would rather respect a lady who's sitting on a loom in a synthetic sari than a corrupt official in a khadi. So just by wearing handloom and just by wearing khadi, you don't become the holy, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
that is
true.
something which you have to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And which also, I think, brings in the larger thing of when we're safeguarding crafts or when we're championing crafts, what is it that we want to actually safeguard through that? Is it just the livelihoods? Because there are many ways to generate livelihoods. There are also many ways to come to that final object, with there are many ways to come to that final object or a garment, which is not about. So, what is it in that practice, and what are those values in a practice that we want to propagate through having crafts? And that's a much bigger question to address. But bringing it back to the IP question, which is where I like Shweta, and we had a very interesting conversation earlier of different kinds of models, looking at what is it that we seek to safeguard, and what would be meaningful ways of doing this, so that you're not just making it more difficult to engage with. For any crafts person, getting more businesses and getting more opportunities to practice their craft is important, rather than just fighting for these issues where we know that the crafts community doesn't have the bandwidth or the resources to enforce this, and we don't want anybody else to become gatekeepers either, which we've seen. But what we have seen is, if there are ways that it can be enforced, even if it wasn't being done in the right spirit, it is possible. So at that point, Shweta, please, Shwe.
Sure, thank you so much. Chipping in on a couple of points just to clarify. Esoterically, yes, Ravi, I totally agree with you that there is great difficulty every time we try to ring fence something that is cultural IP, but that is literally my bread and butter. So I do have to talk a little bit about how it's possible to protect communities. And I want to give some examples from, if you look at what's happened in the traditional knowledge space, when we look at biodiversity, when we look at patent law, there have been some interesting examples that would perhaps translate very interestingly into the craft sphere. But before we do that, I've been, while you've been talking to everyone, Achal, I've taken the opportunity to see some of the comments that have come in the chat box. And so I want to take a couple of steps back and go back to the basics a little bit, illustratively, to be able to explain how the domain of intellectual property covers each space. So if you look, for example, at the kind of work that Ismail Bhai does. Now, that is a traditional craft language. So that is community owned. So something that is community owned, practiced by communities, something that has a history that goes back hundreds of years, even the motifs, not just the manner and mode of creating that particular craft, but also the motifs go back as long as they do, then something like that is ideally protected under the Geographical Indications Act. Now, the difficulty with getting a GI registration is you have to appreciate a couple of things. One is that GI, unlike a trademark, for example, like a trademark is a monopoly that is given to an individual or to an establishment. GI is meant to be community owned. By its very nature, only an association of persons who are practitioners of the craft or a representative of that association can apply for a GI. So nobody is actually a gatekeeper of a GI. So anybody who practices that craft according to the specifications that are spelled out would automatically be eligible to apply, even if they're not part of the original group of applicants. They can apply to be a registered user, right? So they can apply to essentially be on the list of practitioners of the craft. The difficulty happens when, see, you have to appreciate that there cannot in craft or textile language be any hard and fast rules in terms of, the criteria that go into a craft. So while Ismail Bhai was talking, I shared some information in the chat box, which suggested that the Kutch Ajrak GI itself encompasses screen printing, batik, bandhni, and Ajrak practitioners in their list. So what are the contours of a particular craft's GI registration? Or what are the rules that determine that this particular craft is being practiced in an authentic manner? Is really up to the association and the collective to come together and decide. So if the collective basically files a badly drafted GI application, which does not end up capturing some of the ways in which the craft is practiced, then the ability to prevent someone else from misusing the name of that craft by practicing it in a different way gets significantly reduced. Of course, there is also the resource issue in terms of how do you expect traditional practitioners to go after those that are manufacturing fakes in the market. So it's very, very hard for them. Now coming into the domain of copyrights, because trademarks ultimately are for words. We're looking at, motives, design motives, and copyrights. So when you're looking at a traditional motive, no one can copyright a traditional motive, something that they didn't create. But I will now move to David's example. For example, like his language or his way of interpreting ikats, for example. He's taken a traditional art form like ikat, but is given a very modern interpretation. So if anyone is, and I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the kind of work that David does, that's a very modern, very unique signature style of interpretation of ikats. Now, the moment you're doing that and you're not using a traditional motif, even though you may be using ikat as an art form, your motifs or your representation or your garments, then you can secure a copyright protection over something like that. So that is what is, and copyright does not have to be registered. Copyright is something that the law itself was created to protect art for art's sake. Whereas the Designs Act was created to protect art for commerce's sake. So when it comes to copyright, the moment a piece of work is created, so if you look at the kind of work that Ravi does, he may use block printing as a technique, but his motifs are completely his own. So technically, whether Ravi wants to or not, whether he wants to assert it or not, he is still the copyright owner of motifs of that nature. But you and I were talking about this earlier prior to the call. What happens when someone uses a design language, right? The problem is there's nothing in our laws which protects design language. And that is a problem for the simple reason that today, if somebody uses a misdescription for something. And I see this, I mean, I'm a big champion of Jamdani. I've been having a lot of conversations about Jamdani for a long time. And people use the term Jamdani, they are fast and furious with the term, and they use it for power looms, they use it for a whole lot of things. Now, the problem is that nobody, rightly so, can gatekeep Jamdani. So today, if you say something is Ikkat inspired, what is the community that gets impacted if it's not actually Ikkat inspired, or if Ikkat has been misdescribed there? Because Ikkat doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to a whole host of countries. So the difficulty of being able to stop somebody from a misdescription will have to depend, sort of be dependent on whether there is an underlying right that belongs to somebody, whether there is a copyright, whether there is a design right, whether there is a GI right. Only when there is either a community right or a monopoly right in an individual or organization can you turn around and say that, you can't use this particular motif or this form. So
that's really interesting point, and she's dropped out.
Yeah,
Uh,
let's give it.
let's
Yeah,
give
she's
it a
back.
minute. Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't quite know what happened and why I got knocked out.
no
But
worries.
It's just the passion.
so basically, that's essentially the most important part of being able to seek redressal for misdescriptions, etc. Right? Now, coming to community ownership versus individual ownership. There's a great example in relation to the, at the time we were talking about the Convention on Biodiversity, and there was a lot of furor. Many of you would have seen it in the press also at that point in time about how, somebody applied for getting a patent for turmeric, the use of turmeric, and so on. So there was a lot of furor about India's biodiversity and its misuse, right? So back in late 1980s, I think around 1987, there was an excellent initiative that happened. So basically, there was this Tropical Botanical Garden Research Institute, and scientists from there were in the Agastamalai Hills of the southern Western Ghats in Kerala. And they were essentially collecting samples of medicinal plants from there by seeking help of the local Kani or Kanikar community. They're one of the 33 odd tribes that live in the Western Ghats. And they have a lot of medicinal practices that were known to that particular community. So they realized that the Kani guides who were accompanying them for this whole medicinal plant, collection exercise, they noticed that they were eating these berries. And they said, oh, what are these berries? So they said, oh, we call them Arogya Pacha. And essentially, when we are in the forest without food for a long time, it keeps us energetic. So the scientists took samples, they went back to the labs, and they realized that these berries had immuno-enhancing and anti-fatigue properties. So that was very interesting. And so they did a lot of research. It took them about 10 years, and they eventually created a medicine for naturopathy called Jivani, where Arogyopacha was the main ingredient. So they came back to the community and they said, look, we're planning to give a manufacturing license to the Arya Vaidya pharmacy in Coimbatore. Before we do that, we want to start a collaboration with you so that you get 50% of the license fee and 50% of the royalty from the entire exploitation, because without you, this product wouldn't have happened. And it was so interesting because that was a great example where someone whose heart was in the right place tried to create a structure to give back to the community. The community no one had a bank account in the community. So the scientist himself went and opened a personal bank account with his documentation just to be able to give back. Now, obviously, we need to have a structured, format like this. This was somebody wanting to give back to the community, somebody recognizing it and creating a model like this in a very unique scenario. But if you transpose something like that into the textile sector, why do we have to be dependent on the largesse of, designers or whoever else who's using traditional, community language and motif and design vocabulary to actually think about ways to give back? Why can't we have, sort of an access and benefit sharing model, perhaps that civil society, comes together to create, which can be presented as a possible framework to be used to give back to communities whenever design language is used from communities? That is perhaps a far better way to be able to enforce what truly belongs to the communities than law itself. Law has its limitations, and I say this as a lawyer myself.
Yeah, so because even in many of these discussions, while the there is no legal way of addressing it, I feel like the larger community does have a ethical and a moral responsibility, right? And so even in the case of, I might as well say it, in the case of Sabyasachi or Tarunta Ilyani using all of this, uh, while these are collaborators, these people have invested in the fashion. I don't think there must be very few fashion designers actually that haven't collaborated with craftspeople, have not given lots of business to craftspeople. And the last thing we want to do is make it difficult to do that by having some sort of punitive measures, etc. But how do you start encouraging better practices? And I think the betrayal is when you normalize digitally printing something that looks like craft, uh, which is where it feels like, okay, you feel let down to say, okay, this can actually could have been block printed, this could have been a cut which was actually hand woven, but not taking that route when the opportunity comes for, like, maybe it is a more glorified opportunity and therefore it hurts more. But this normalization and the fact that you can get away with it feels a little bit of a letdown. But the larger problem is the fact when it gets sold as craft. So one is this whole accreditation, being able to use these opportunities, but I think we have a much larger problem of how do you go after fakes. So while Ismail Bhai said this has been happening, this will continue to happen, the fact is that even as far as I know, and I might have been misinformed, uh, इस्माइल भाई आप बताइए, अजरकपुर में भी सुना है मैंने कि जो स्कूल के बच्चे हैं वो यूनिफॉर्म पहनते हैं, वो अजरक जैसी लगती है, वो स्क्रीन प्रिंटेड अजरक है। तो क्या ये चीज के बारे में हमें खुश होना चाहिए कि चलो अजरक का जो लैंग्वेज है, जो एस्थेटिक है, एटलीस्ट वो तो और जगह फैल रहा है और लोग यूज कर रहे हैं, या फिर हमें दुखी होना चाहिए कि भाई वो अजरक क्यों नहीं कर पाए? इतना अजरक तो बन ही सकता है कि स्कूल की यूनिफॉर्म बन जाए। आपको अनम्यूट होना पड़ेगा।
आपको अनम्यूट करना पड़ेगा इस्माइल भाई।
हाँ, हो गया।
हाँ बिल्कुल हो गया।
अच्छा, ये गांव हमने नया बनाया, अदरकपुर, और उसके अंदर जो जो काम पड़ा ना, उसकी मैंने कमेटियां बना दी। कोई मस्जिद का काम देख रहा है, कोई जमात का काम देख रहा है, कोई स्कूल का काम देख रहा है। अब ये स्कूल वालों ने ये बना तो दिया, लेकिन हमने उनको बोला कि भाई या तो ये बनाना नहीं था, बनाना था तो सच बनाना था। अब थोड़ी बातचीत चल रही है और असली पहनाएंगे अभी।
हाँ,
लेकिन
ये तो
ये जो है ना, ये मतलब कुछ इकोनॉमी के हिसाब से, कुछ सस्ते के हिसाब से। दूसरी बात ये है कि जो कॉटन है उसको धोने में तकलीफ होती है, और पॉलिएस्टर को धोने में तकलीफ नहीं होती। यही वही बात है।
बिल्कुल।
लेकिन असली जो चीज है वो तो असली है, नकली है वो नकली है। अभी ये बात चल रही है उन लोगों में, कमिटी में, कि भाई ये गलत कर दिया है हम लोगों ने,
हाँ,
तो इसको ठीक करना पड़ेगा।
नहीं नहीं, बहुत अच्छा हुआ कि आपने हमें बताया, क्योंकि वही मुझे
हाँ,
लग रहा था कि हो सकता है ये भी ठीक है कि अगर उनका जो नहीं खरीद पाए, वो एटलीस्ट
हम्म,
ये तो दिख रहा है कि वो चाह रहा है खरीदना, कि कोई
अच्छा रहे। हाँ,
वो चाह तो रहा है कि भाई ये ऐसा लगे। सो ओके,
हाँ,
देयर माइट बी अ लॉट ऑफ कंज्यूमर्स, बट देयर इज अ लॉट ऑफ कंज्यूमर्स हु डोंट नो। ये बहुत सारे
हाँ,
होंगे लोग जो लेना चाहते होंगे पर उन्हें नहीं पता है कि ये
हाँ,
ठीक
हाँ,
है या नहीं ठीक है, और फिर वो गलत
हाँ,
चीज लेंगे। तो उसको
हाँ,
रोकने का, कल को आप कहीं पे भी जाइए, ऑनलाइन किसी भी वेबसाइट पे जाइए, अगर आप अजरक का देखेंगे, 50 चीजें होंगी जो अजरक प्रिंट कहलाएंगी। वो आपको पता नहीं
हाँ,
है वो डिजिटल है कि स्क्रीन प्रिंट है, कि उन्होंने एक्चुअली
सही है।
एक्चुअल अजरक यूज किया है ये। और वो फोटो से बताना भी मुश्किल नहीं है, कोई एक्सपर्ट
हाँ,
भी देखेगा तो उसको बताना मुश्किल
हाँ,
है।
सही है,
तो
सही है।
ये जो छोटी हमारी प्रॉब्लम्स हैं कि भाई नाम कहाँ आया, किसको आया, ये उससे कहीं बड़ी प्रॉब्लम है कि जब हम कहते हैं कि मार्केट्स नहीं है, जब मार्केट्स हों भी और हमारे पास वो क्राफ्ट्समैन हैं भी जो वो मार्केट्स को आंसर कर पा रहे हैं, पर देर आर टू मेनी पीपल हु आर फेक and making it available cheaply. There is too much in cases of entrepreneurs like Ravi, where there is we can do something, where the state and the government can be supportive of this in a way which is meaningful. So what are the steps? And as we've discussed, it is not always, we cannot just leave it to communities to kind of do it. In the beautiful example that Shway also shared, somebody who realizes this value needs to kind of make these frameworks to say what are the things that we advocate for, and so that we are advising people, and we are able to take more of a role of advocacy, because policy making and finding the right policy will take time, and it will not be an iterative process possibly as much as we'd like. So you don't want to be stuck with the policy that doesn't work for you. So, Shway, any thoughts on that? And then possibly I can ask somebody from Creative Dignity to also think about what are the next steps that they would like to take.
Before I go to next steps, I wanted to say that, this Ajrak is a great example of what I was talking about earlier. That, you know, uh, if you look at the list of registered users, it also includes screen printers, right? So then if that is included in the GI registration itself, we no longer have a basis to say that hand block printing alone is Ajrak or screen printing isn't Ajrak. So we have to look very carefully at, how we position these craft forms, how we describe them in our applications, because in order to be able to take a position about what is right and what is wrong, it can't be on the basis of our perception alone. It also has to be on the basis of the documentation. One quick point I wanted to make, also in terms of what Ismail Bhai said at the beginning about how there are people who give what happens, who owns the leftover fabric or who owns things that are rejected. So under the Copyright Act, there is a beautiful provision for commissioned works. So if somebody, for example, is commissioning a piece of textile where they're really not making a design contribution to it, but is just getting a craftsperson to do a commissioned work for them, then technically they are supposed to be the owner of the commissioned work, provided, what is a commissioned work? Provided they bear all the costs and the risks associated with the production of the commissioned work. If they don't bear the costs and the risks, if they, for example, dump all the extras on the artisan, they actually can lose copyright over the commissioned work, and the artisan can do as they please with it, with the leftovers. So, there are clever solutions in the law, but equally, I understand that it's all very well for me to sit in my, metaphoric glass bubble and talk about the solutions in the law, but that won't reach the level of the artisans or the practitioners of the craft or even designers. I mean, so many times I've heard designers tell me that, oh, is it true? What's the point of enforcing my rights? Because it's true that when someone makes 7 changes in a garment, they escape copyright. That's completely imaginary. I mean, it's an urban legend. So, people don't know much about IP, and as a result, they're not able to find a solution to IP. I think no one should be a gatekeeper of, community resources. Solutions have to come. We have to have the courage to call out a misdescription or cultural appropriation. Great example, the Maori Haka law in New Zealand, for example, where they said the Maori Haka is something that cannot be used without attribution. You can't just use it as a sort of, like something cool and indigenous that you start incorporating into films and everything else. So they have very fixed and strict rules about how the Maori Haka can and can't be used. We have a traditional knowledge digital library when it comes to our bioresources. Why can't we have a digital library when it comes to our textile craft forms throughout the country? We create a digital library. We identify each craft on the basis of, its characteristics. Then it's much easier to be able to say that if there is a misappropriation of that craft, that this links back to the digital library. Some ideas to consider.
So I've been trying to look into the chat for further questions, because I think this has all been very enriching. I think it's all been very useful. And, there are a bunch of, I think, ideas for CD, but also other people to take. How do you draft something meaningful? How do you kind of, have some rules of engagements between designers and the community, which will be respectful to both, but doesn't make it so overbearing and difficult that, they're not encouraged to do it. How do we engage with the government in a way that, whatever that they come up with still makes sense to us? And also maybe, like sense of what are the legal protection available to us. So how do you negotiate better at the stage when these orders are coming in, or you're talking to your customers? क्या आप डाल सकते हैं, क्या लीगली पॉसिबल है, क्या नहीं है, इस सब की समझ आर्टिजन्स को होना बहुत एक बड़ा काम है. So can I now ask maybe Bhakti to tell us if there are any questions?
There aren't questions.
There are more comments.
There are more comments. Kunal did ask about design ownership, but I think Shwet responded to quite a lot of it and broke it down. Shwet, do you want to elaborate any further on design ownership, or
I think
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
was
I think I've addressed
yeah,
it.
between copyright and all of that, we've
Right.
kind of covered
Right.
that.
Right.
What I will then ask is Meera, as co-chair of the Creative Dignity Network, to come in and kind of just maybe have a chat about what are possible ways that creative dignity would like to take. And I think there's also a lot of interest in having a session on khadiness by Ravi, having a session on more on these rights and where they begin, what is possible by Shwe. And I think that those are many things for us to explore, and just learning more about the kind of ways that David has been talking about, how they're engaging with craftspeople, where innovation, etc. So the design doesn't need to happen only at the level of a garment or a motif, but there is so much more that goes into it. And how do we even bring out these stories? And of course, with Khatribai and on all this whole journey of Ajrakpur and becoming a community leader, and how do you work with large communities? What are these challenges? How do you make it democratic but still meaningful? There's so much here to unpack. And now I will stop speaking.
Okay, I think this has been a really vibrant panel, as it promised us that it would be. And thank you, Achal, for the moderation. Thank you, all the panelists. I think each one of you has brought a very unique point. You've unpacked a lot of issues, problems, even thoughts for us to reflect on. And I think it's very clear to me that we need to get Shweta into the CD collective immediately. So we are going to kind of ensure that you continue your association with us. And I think while we do look at that the sector has grown over all these decades, and there are so many more stakeholders now, who have interests, who are playing a very vital role in keeping the sector vibrant and dynamic. And I think for me, crafts has always been that. It's a dynamic space. And when you talk of copyrights and trademarks and laws, you are actually trying to fix and capture something, which in essence has always been dynamic. It has been a response of interplay, of trade, of a chance conversation between two people. And that's a really very important aspect that at least I would like to, when we use words like safeguard, I would actually like to use the word nurture and conserve. And so, I think what even Shweta said, Shwetashri said, about creating a digital library, I think it is sort of aligning with a thought process that we've been talking about at Creative Dignity, about, building a creative commons with all the stakeholders, of the sector, so that, there is an understanding, there's information, there's credit, there's a possibility for people to get inspired from each other's work, while maintaining the provenance, the originality, and with a very robust credit system, and which will allow this dynamism and play to continue. So I think that's really the work that is there before us, and if everyone feels that that's the direction we would all like to join hands to and towards, I think Creative Dignity as a platform, we'd be very happy to begin this. And I think today's meeting was a kind of beginning for us to explore this idea. So I really look forward to doing more sessions, and from those sessions, through the collective wisdom of all of us here, I hope that we can, in time, create this Creative Commons, which will be so wonderful. And it will be a way for nurturing, conserving, sustaining, and really celebrating, all this intelligence, wisdom, culture that we have got through so many centuries and centuries of creative people, not only artisans, but all of you here on the panel as well. Yeah, thank you. Would anyone like to say something? I see Chandrasekhar, who's done a lot of work also. Chandrasekhar, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I think we encourage the audience to just
Hi.
like raise their hand and join the conversation.
Yes. Thank you, Mira, for this and wonderful interaction. A lot of the insights have been shared. So great to be listening to all of you. A few things which I had mentioned in my comments, I would like to repeat, is the complexity of entire India in terms of variety of practices, variety of people, variety of regions, interpretation. So it's a very, very large. And if I look at it very simply to address this issue of copyrights, you must tell what you sell. And if that means you're basically asking for honesty, your own dignity, own pride, and I think that will solve major problem. Now, if I do, मैं अगर नैपथॉल के साथ अगर मैं डाइज बना करके और मेरा कपड़ा बना रहा हूँ, तो यू टेल पीपल दैट मैं नैपथॉल इस्तेमाल करता हूँ यार, ये मेरा खूबी है. और somebody से मैं आटा डाल के वेजिटेबल बना रहा हूँ पिगमेंट में, तो वो मेरा खूबी है. So you start taking ownership of what creative idea. I'm saying using natural dye is not creative or only naturalized creative. That's not the issue at all. We take ownership of your specialization, and I'm telling you, everyone will benefit. क्योंकि मुझे पड़ोसी की तरह देखना नहीं, मुझे अपनी खूबी आगे लानी है. If you do that, I think it will be, I mean, and for that, it basically awareness has to be created. People have to be pushed to, share what is their uniquity. The people are generally scared. They want to hide, or they just want to copy and take an easier way. But I think each manufacturer has somewhere some uniquity in them, and if they bring that out, I think more the merrier. I think it'll be wonderful energy. Yeah, that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Would any of the panelists like to make some closing statement?
I just wanted to say thank you that you all had a conversation like this. Sometimes just being able to bring people from all these different perspectives together is a very important initial step. And I, for one, definitely enjoyed being part of this panel. So thank you so much. And thank you, Achal, for moderating it so beautifully.
I'd like to also, add that thank you for organizing this. It's been very interesting, and I'm glad that we got an opportunity to interact with each other.
Yes.
Thank you, Anchal, Meera, CD for inviting me here. Worthy of inviting me here. I definitely would like to come and talk to you guys again.
So Ravi, you're not getting away, huh? We are going to organize a session on khadiness with you.
Definitely.
Okay.
I see that there is so much still left to unpack. But yeah, of course, thank you all the wonderful panelists. I think, all of us are going back richer because of the discussions today and everything that you brought on board. And I think that is, like Meera said, this should not be like we're not doing this in a vacuum to say, oh, let's come together and just talk about this. There are some very specific kind of, I think, areas that we see that need more work, but can also be like easier ways to do it instead of saying, oh my God, this is so complicated. We don't even know where to begin. I think there are some really good ways to begin. And I hope that all of us can continue this dialogue. And I think I just want to add that whenever we come into a conversation, we come with something to say. But I felt like all the panelists today were also very open to listening to what the others were saying and responding instead of just kind of saying, this is what it is for me. And I think that is the space that we want to nurture, that everybody should be able to kind of take in the other point of view and say, then come to that common space from which hopefully better ideas will emerge. So I think enough thank yous have happened, and have a great rest of the day. We've already had some disappointing Olympics news, but let's just hope there will be some better news
We'll
coming.
win the race in the long run. Let's
Yeah,
hope. Cheers to
long
that.
run. Always look at the long run. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank
Good
you
evening.
everyone. Thank you
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Anchal, for really bringing out all these perspectives. Thank you.
And thank you, Bhakti, for all the legroom and the back end work you put together for this panel.
And happy Handloom Day.
Happy Handloom Day.
That's important. Yeah.